This is Seth from Pages and Panels, and I am thrilled to be talking to the creative force behind one of the exciting new series, The Last Wardens, published by Mad Cave Studios. With me, I have Amit Tishler. Amit is an LA-based creative director, software designer, animator, and writer. He has brought his diverse talents to shows, games, and immersive experience for entertainment brands such as Cartoon Network, RIP, Warner Brothers, HBO, Skydance, Nickelodeon, and more. A prolific writer and content creator, Amit is developing multiple original graphic novels and comic book titles with publishers such as Mad Cave Studios and Humanoids Publishing, as well as a slate of original TV shows for network studios and streamers worldwide. Additionally, with me, I have Elliot Sperl. Elliot is a writer, director, and storyboard artist who has worked at Bento Box Entertainment on Fox's award-winning animated sitcom Bob's Burgers, great show, and The Great North. His resume includes working as an assistant retake director on Apple TV's Central Park, the action comedy adaptation of Axe Cop for FXX, and other animated shows featured on HBO, MTV, and the WWE Network. Elliot has teamed up with Amit to co-create original comic titles for publishers such as Mad Cave Studios and Humanoids Publishing. Thank you all for being here. Y'all have such an impressive resume. I don't know how y'all have time to do it all.
That's what lunch breaks are for. Thanks,
true.
man.
That's
Glad
awesome.
to be here.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I'm glad y'all are here. Today we're here to talk about The Last Wardens, which is an exciting new title, as I mentioned earlier. It's this action-packed supernatural horror story. It's got a lot of energy behind it. The first issue I thought was this fun amalgamation of like body horror and like chaos and all that. I literally finished reading the first issue and I was like, what did I read? But I was also like, I can't wait to read issue 2. So for those who haven't had a chance to dive in the story, what's the story about? What can readers expect? What are y'all most excited about it for?
All right, I guess I'll pick it up. Elliot can continue from there. Just to recap the story, this series essentially tells the story of Danielle Pryor. She's a small town girl. She's living in a rustic fictional town called Bleakwood, Oregon in the year 1975. So it's a period piece. And her life's kind of shit. She's got an alcoholic father and a hole in her wallet, and just one day her life goes from bad to worse when her long-lost brother, Bruce, he comes back from the Vietnam War after being MIA and essentially presumed dead. But Bruce also brings something back with him, and he's being plagued by this mysterious and monstrous mutation. But the problem is that that's also not the only thing that's haunting him, because Bruce is also being hunted by this, the best way to describe it is an incompetent team of paranormal misfits. And this leads Bleakwood to quickly becoming ground zero of this supernatural battle that has to force Danielle to choose between everything she holds dear and, the fate of the world as a whole. This story is really emotional. It's super chaotic and it's action-packed and it's visually beautiful, full of tragedy, full of comedy, and a fair amount of, like you said, gratuitous violence. But underneath all of that, it is a mystery story. So we want readers to go into this story through Danny's point of view. And we want them to have questions galore. Like, answers are going to require some work. And readers are only going to get them whenever Danielle gets them. So it's a very fast-moving train, but it's also very slow to unravel.
And jumping right off of that, there's a lot going on in this title. But between the bits of body horror and the chaos on every panel, what it's really about is about failure, how to chew it up, spit it out, and ask for seconds. That's the emotional core of, that ties back to every single character and situation throughout the entire series. If I had to boil it down as to why, though, because that's kind of a good question, like why we even make this comic in the first place. It's because failure, we wanted to tell a story about why failure is a universal experience. It's something that marks and defines us. So we wanted to make a story that's based purely on that. So watching these characters, Yes, exactly. I think that's the opening line, right? We just start with that.
Yeah, we just start the first page and it yells at you that you're a failure.
Yep,
It's
perfect.
your abusive dad in comic form.
So what I love that you all have put together, because yeah, failure is definitely a very I guess relatable theme. But you also have other familiarities with this story, right? The small town charm, the kind of ragtag team. What were some sort of inspirations behind the story? Any other mediums that kind of inspired the Last Wardens themselves, or even the location? The idea of having it in Oregon. I'm assuming it's in the fall time, based on the color palettes, which I'm a big fan of.
Yeah.
Northern fall time view. I'm based out of Texas, so we don't get a fall. It's just summer all year. But what inspiration did you all have with this story that kind of, help support that?
So I would break this down into two parts because, well, first off, on the fall note, no spoilers, but you're gonna love issue 3.
Okay.
Based purely on that phrase. Based purely on that, you have a lot to look forward to in issue 3. But for the inspiration of the small town, that's interesting because that actually, and Amit, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that actually the town of Bleakwood kind of came out of the creation of Danny as a character more than anything else.
No,
it
was in the original
was it
as well. Yeah,
I feel like you've been working on this
name as well. By name as was always
really
the first town to get hit. Yeah,
was it always the first town to get? Oh, I guess
it was. I know. Wow. It's been years. That actually ties to something a little interesting that is related to this question, though. It's the fact that this iteration of this story was not the first. We've been developing Last Wardens and kind of testing it out for years. And it took multiple iterations and kind of reinventing the story from different angles until it reached its ultimate form, which is the Last Wardens. So this has been, like, I think in a lot of interviews, this came up simply because people really connect to Danielle. Like, she's a very relatable character, and she's a character that people tend to like. And I think there's multiple reasons as to why, but the story really feels like it was tailor-made to be her story, but it wasn't. A lot of elements from the original run, when we started developing this story, she wasn't in it at all. And that's what Elliot was referring to. At some point, we introduced Danielle into the mix, and that really shifted how we're telling the story. But she was actually not part of our original introduction into this world. But it had a lot of the same elements, like a lot of the wardens, like Worm and like Bricks. And as well as Bleakwood as this first town that gets hit by a disaster. And the setting of Oregon was always just very atmospheric. Honestly, we were looking for a place that had multiple elements. One of them was the fact that we needed a town that was small and isolated. We needed a time period that also isolated the town. And this came as we were developing this, and we realized if we have a whole world, and in our world lore, the secret order, these wardens are essentially going from one spot to another to squash these very specific kinds of threat and essentially leave unnoticed. That's going to be very, very hard to do in modern day. Not impossible, but at that point, if you are making this a current day story, you're having to solve a lot of different logistical problems on why isn't everybody aware that this is happening? Because with one phone, you can just like capture footage and put it on TikTok, and that's pretty much it. It's not that it's unsolvable, but now your story is becoming about something else, and it shifts the focus from where you want to be. So a lot of these elements, the time period, the location, and again, the location was very like, we always viewed it as something that we wanted to, and it really is fun how that ended up being the case, but lined up closer to like Halloween. It had a very Halloween-y vibe. It's a very monster movie inspired thing. And Oregon fall time, kind of perfect for that. So it just had all of these elements that creeped over time as we were trying to just create a certain atmosphere and fit the world to allow us to tell the kinds of stories that we want to tell.
So I've seen in other interviews that, and you've already kind of touched base on this. This story kind of started closer to 2018. So, like you said,
Mhm.
it's been in development for a while. So, for anybody who listens to this or reads the write up, especially if they're an aspiring writer, how did you all know when it was ready to actually go into print? If that's the case,
Oh,
like,
wow.
what was your definition of done? Because it sounds like you had multiple iterations.
Yeah. Uh, I would say it's not really up to us. That's the truth. Like, this
Mm,
is you determine that something is done when you finally crack that nut, when somebody says, yes, I will publish it. That's how
mm,
you know you made it, right? It's not just finding the right buyer or the right partner. It's literally trial and error. Failure, right? It's the whole idea of like, well, the first thing failed. Why did it fail? Why didn't it stick? I mean, they liked it, but they didn't like, and there's always a lot of factors to it, right? Some of them could be completely unrelated to the story. But one thing is undeniable. If you are constantly questioning why something didn't fly and it forces you to try and tweak and iterate on it, the moment you know you've made it or you got your final iteration is the moment that somebody decides to say, yes, we will do this. So that gets determined for you. The best that you can do from a creative standpoint is keep iterating and keep pitching it. I think a mistake that a lot of people do is they sit around and just massage their work endlessly, and it's never
mhm,
going to be done, and it's never going to be perfect, and you're never going to have the objectivity to know when that's perfect. That's for your readers to determine, or that's for your publishers to determine if that's the track that you're taking. So I think for us, that was always the metric. Like, did this stick? Did it resonate? Did someone decide to say yes? And Last Wardens was the time that it went through also different names. It started
I
as
was just about to ask that.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and by the way, this is actually a kind of a fun little detail because I feel like it could be, I don't know, maybe helpful to anybody listening. But so our first version, what was it? It was Warlocked,
Warlocked, yeah,
right?
I believe so.
Warlock. Yeah. Then we called it Night Legion, and Night Legion as a property went through a lot of the iterations, including like the last version of Night Legion finally had Danny Pryor. So that was already included. It was basically almost ready to go. And when we were about to pitch this to Mad Cave Studios in what at the time was really its ultimate form, um, I remember looking at the catalog of titles that they had, and I realized that there was, and I don't remember the exact name of it. There was another title that when I looked at it, I went, this sounds a little too like Night Legion. It was a Midnight Squad or something like that. And I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, this is just, it's one of those associations that if you've done the kind of work of like pitching shows or pitching comics or pitching really any product, you know that it doesn't even matter if it has nothing to do with whatever product is already on the catalog. It's enough to trigger that association for a buyer to get cold feet. So very last minute, we're like, oh, we got to change the name and we got to update our pitch, like just to be safe, so that that's not the thing that kills you. And that's where the title Last Wardens actually came from. It was a week before the pitch. We just changed Night Legion to Last Wardens, and bam, that's the version that stuck.
That's awesome. So, you mentioned having it as a period piece kind of removes a lot of logistics. Technically, it doesn't have to be in the 70s. Are readers going to see as to why the 70s come into play? For me
Yes.
personally, the vibe I got was more, you're probably going to have really good music during that time, at least when I was reading it. But, why the 70s of any decade?
So it actually, now you actually cannot separate it from the 70s. That's the truth. It's not you can associate it. I think like definitely the vibe, the visual vibe, and Elliot can talk more about that, but the visual vibe and the marketing that went behind it, like that's us adopting everything that all the sensitivities that the 70s as a decade gives us. But we actually incorporated it into the story in a lot of ways. The original choice was really made from a very pragmatic place. It was we needed a time period that is modern, that has enough technology, but once again, not the kind of modern technology that allows the kinds of disasters that they're causing or the kinds of chaos that they're causing for news to travel really, really fast, right? So it was this like nice little sweet spot where we could start playing the story from the angle that we wanted to. But at that point, once we made the choice, we really dug into different story elements and forced it to matter in ways that are really cool. So Bruce, right? Like if you look at the entire timeline of Bruce is a Vietnam War vet or a Vietnam War survivor. And that already put us in a time period that has a specific tone to it, that has specific political problems that affected people at the time. If you look at Bruce and Joseph Pryor's dynamic, like his father, he is a Korean War vet, which at that point you're looking back and you're like, of course, the timeline makes sense. So a lot of the toxicity and even the stuff that he tells him, he's like, I did not go, there's a line that he actually says, I did not, like fight in the Korean Wars to be embarrassed by my son doing. So all of a sudden, this baggage really affects our character's way of life and the kind of problems that this family had. I can tell you, and this is without revealing anything because we've built a lot of ongoing lore for this series with the goal of, as we continue, we unravel more. That time period, the fact that it's set in the 70s has a direct impact on multiple characters, whether they realize it or not. Whether it's the Wardens, leader Riddle, or whether it's Danielle herself, and even like Sierra and Lila. Like there's a lot of different things that at that point went, we are in the 70s, let's make the best out of this. And it made its way into the story in a way that over time becomes more and more pronounced and more significant. But yeah, as far as like what it gave us the minute we did it, not story-wise, Elliot could walk you through that.
Yeah, so beyond story on the visual side, I don't know if you had a chance to check out all the fun posts we've been doing on our social media, but I basically built those to lean into kind of the visual aesthetic we were hoping to really hit, which was the grindhouse look.
Yeah.
And Francesco Segala, the colorist, obviously knocked that out of the park. He's been killing it on every page, trying to hit that, the color and everything else to really match the style. So, and even things like the fashion as well, that's something that we wanted to really take into account with, how Danny dresses, the people of town, Bleakville dress, and what's available. We wanted to incorporate all of that into the design. It's actually funny because going back to the design, I did the initial sketches of the characters and the monsters and everything like that. But I'm an animator, and so my style is pretty cartoony originally. It's pretty big eyes, big overly expressive mouths, et cetera, et cetera. So our first initial things we had in our deck were kind of a little exaggerated. So when we handed it off to Rui, he definitely elevated my work a hell of a lot more than what we started with.
So you bring up a point. I'll jump ahead a bit. On the visuals. Sure. One thing I noted in my review is I feel like there's a lot of little nuggets of information. I don't know how much y'all can talk about. But I feel like, in addition to the color tone, for example, there's this intentional infrastructure design around Danny's house, right? The fence is broken. There's also a chicken. I noticed
there is a chicken.
There also is a chicken that pops up multiple times. Is that something readers should keep an eye out for? Because I noticed it. Okay. I put that in my review, and I was like, "There's this chicken. I don't know why it's in there, but it's very specific."
Definitely put a chicken check mark right on that one for
sure. Here's a weird question: did I send you the preview for issue 2?
You have. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. I didn't.
Okay. So
any of this conversation.
When we both saw that mention of the chicken and smiled, when you read issue 2, you'll know why. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay.
But yes.
but how was that, from a creative point, how was that kind of putting all that in there? What was that how did that impact sort of the style of the story? Because I read a lot of comics, and so sometimes you'll have comics where the background kind of is more focused on like color palettes, right? Like it's trying to emote like a specific tone. This one, I feel like there's so much detail in the background. Like as you're really reading it, how was that collaborative process with the artistic team? Is that something they kind of naturally put on their own, or is that something you all were like, hey, even though it's a small town, I want more detail?
No, that was definitely them. Credit where credit's due. They are incredible artists all around. But what you're talking about with the background is interesting because it's not just the background, it's also the lettering that we added a lot of really fun, interesting things into. So obviously on the first, I think, page or two of issue 1, you'll see that Frank, our letterer, we had to give him a little bit more than the typical speech bubbles for this project. It was much more of an illustrative process. So yeah, he had to add a lot of interesting things that will come up later on, I will say, without spoiling anything.
And I think it's worth thinking, like, it's an interesting question because obviously you have like detail and stylization, but when you said detail, I think Elliot took it as stylization. I took it from a different angle, and I guess both can be true. As far as specific details, those are usually scripted. Like, so the chicken that was mentioned in the script, and I can tell you that there's going to be more announcement about this in October, but there are adaptations of The Last Wardens coming, and a lot of these details end up carrying over to whatever scripts we end up adapting to different mediums, for the same reason that some of these details, like the chicken, are there for a reason. So very often we will, in the script, emphasize something specific. Like there's the moments where you give a lot of just creative freedom here, do whatever you want, but there are, especially in a story that is about an unraveling mystery with a lot of little clues, there are details that we are extremely explicit about, to the point where we're like, you have to play it like this, you have to move like that, because it really ties to some of the revelations that we're making over time. So it is a very good instinct to pay attention to a lot of little things. Because, if you look even in just issue 1, so this is without any spoilers, the moose head that appears in the living room later on comes into play. Same with like the portrait of, like old Grandpa Pryor, like in the background. Like a lot of these details were planted there early intentionally because even in the script, we were like, well, the moose head comes to life all of a sudden and starts talking to them. So there's a lot of little things that we planted for a reason. Some of them are clues. Some of them are just things that we're going to use later on, and they're there for continuity, Chekhov's gun. So it's an interesting mix in that regard. And I think it's easy to tell which is which, because some details just end up landing differently or being highlighted differently. I don't think anybody would, by missing a detail, you won't really get confused with the story. But like you said, if you notice that something kind of stands out and then it makes an appearance again in a more significant way, you're like, okay, this is a fun little payoff. I'm glad I paid attention to it. So it's fun in that way.
I love that. Now shifting gears back to Danny, right? Like we've talked about detail, but you all mentioned that Danny wasn't initially in the script, right? It was more the town. So how was that approach? Like balancing, if she's still the protagonist, did she end up becoming more of her story, or is the town, can readers still kind of expect more of the town is the primary character? Like how does that balance like?
Yeah, it's funny because so going back to the origins of the Wardens, the original story always was very focused on the order itself, on the team, right? The Wardens were the heart and soul of it. It's why, early iterations were called the Night Legion. This is still called the Last Wardens. It's not something based on Danielle's story. So it was always about us building this lore of what's happening in the world and how this team was created and what is their role and what is their journey and the bigger threats. The addition of Danielle was made because we realized that it's going to be a lot more interesting Like if the whole idea is you have this team of paranormal freaks, there's the mystery of how they came together, and who is their enigmatic leader, and what is this like ancient order, and all of those questions. But it becomes a lot more interesting if you're saying that the whole mechanism is they are following a threat, they're going into a certain location. By the time they go in, it is explosive, it is insane, it's utter madness. If they are successful in killing it, destroy all evidence and move on. Sure, that's a very, very fun story vehicle, but it opens an opportunity of what does it feel like to be a person who's just living their lives, having their daily problems, and one day that just like a freight train, right? Like just hits them in the face and you're like, what is going on? And that's exactly what's happening to Danielle. That shift in adding that POV character, that human character who just gets impacted by the Warden's world, really reshaped everything. Because now the mystery is told by a character that, much like the audience, gets hit with something that they weren't even aware is out there. And you have all these questions, but the Wardens are not really concerned with answering them for you because they have a job to do, right? So that's where Danielle actually came from the need to kind of shift the story to a perspective of the, I'm going to put this in air quotes, but the everyday man, like the person who gets impacted by all of these events. And, you know, what ended up happening is that she became the heart of the story, which is fantastic because, once again, through her, we learn more about it. In the end, it's a journey about her admitting failure, letting go of the grief and toxicity and pain that kept her stuck in Bleakwood. You know, the Wardens essentially break into her life and just pull her into this bigger world that's outside, which sets us up for what we want to do in the continuation of the series, which is focus more and more on the different team members, on, okay, what is this bigger threat that's happening in the world that I can tell you in this arc, you will get at least those answers of like, this is loosely how the Wardens were created, this is what they're facing, this is how they operate as a team, and this is the big danger that's happening in the world as a whole, that now Danny's like, well, if this team is our last line of defense, we are royally fucked. Like that's basically where we are.
So with the Last Wardens, what was the balance like from both a storytelling and a visual perspective in the creation of each of their sort of personas, power types, etc.? Because obviously they're all very unique in that way. Again, from a storytelling and visual, like how was that?
Oh, wow. So I believe, trying to think, because there were earlier iterations, very early on, that I think is when I leapt onto this, we started kind of reworking the main cast of the Wardens a lot. And I love this because like I got to bring a lot of the things that, you know, inspired me growing up into each of the monster designs. So with Worm, for example, I was able to, in the initial designs, integrate stuff like, you know, elements from the, like the Zoanoids from Bio Booster Armored Guyver, or hilariously, like the 2000s film Deep Rising, the giant kraken from that movie, if you remember that. Also things like the monsters and magical items from Dungeons and Dragons, which obviously I'm a big fan. And of course, incorporating other things that I also love, horror movie elements like Evil Dead. Obviously, you saw it with like the Moose, right? You know, and obviously, since it's a 1970s piece, a little bit of Scooby-Doo sprinkled on top. You know, it's all kind of there. But yeah, the monsters, yeah, I would say, like I said, each one has a little bit of the stuff that I love in them, and we just kind of rolled with it, and it turned out to be a fantastic team.
And they all had their own, like, in terms of the powers, which you mentioned, like, it was really tied to, I think that was more or less the starting point, right? The visuals kind of came out of it because at that point you came in and said, like, okay, so they're going to look like this, it's going to affect their functionality. The power set was kind of tied to the kinds of personality that they have and the function that they have in the story as well. Because their personalities are not in any way complementary. And that's very much by design, right? but they are, in a sense, tied to or amplified or representative of their power set in a lot of different ways. You know, even you're only in issue 1, but you'll notice over time some things that I think are already relatively obvious about some of these characters. Brix is this like big hulking giant rock monster, but he's also you'll see him be very naive, very friendly, very gentle. He is that kind of like gentle giant who cannot communicate in any way. He is mute. Sira has a lot of attitude, not only towards others, but towards her, let's call it second half, her essentially shadow clone, Lila, who is her own entity, who also can only communicate with the entity that she's tied to, which is Sira. And Worm is kind of an out-of-control anger beast, but he's also very, very pragmatic, and you'll see a lot of interesting redeeming qualities in him as well, as, let's call it, a man of action. But all of this really came down to the kind of dynamic that they're going to have to like face each other with, and by extension with Danielle. Some of them will get along with her more, some of them less, but all for different reasons. And their powers do kind of represent that aggression or that gentleness in contrast. Like it's a lot of stuff that we figured, like, as we were developing, okay, it's this kind of character and we want them to have this kind of personality. What would be an interesting counter to that? Or what would be an interesting foil to that? Or what would make this character so resentful about having these kinds of powers? What would make them more dangerous? So it was a very fluid process that came from that kind of focus.
So without giving too much away, what can readers kind of expect in this first arc? Like what, both from, again, storytelling, visually, what?
More chickens.
More chickens. I love that.
Yeah. I mean, so are you asking specifically about like the story or where it's going in this arc, or
without spoilers? Yeah, this first arc, you know, because oftentimes when you have team stories, there's the origin of the team forming, the team already is established. You know, with this one, you know, again, without giving too much away, like,
yeah,
since there's a town as a component to it, you know, it seems like there's a lot of plot threads. How are y'all managing all that in the first arc, and what can readers kind of expect? Because again, you said there's a much bigger world to be discovered. Yeah. So I imagine there's a lot coming down the line, which is very exciting.
Yeah. So it's a great question, because I think we made a lot of creative choices that tied us to how we're telling this story, and we kind of love it because it tells it in the kind of way that the stories that we like to consume. As far as what you're going to learn by the end of this first arc is very focused on Danielle's story, or her entry into this world. And that's going to remain consistent, right? The Wardens are both a foil and a thing she's going to have to cooperate with. But the focus is going to be on her trying to figure out. You'll learn a little bit more about their origins, not everything and not all the specifics, but you'll know more or less what happened. You'll understand more about the connection between them and what happened to her brother as well. You will get a clue about what is the greater threat in the world without understanding it fully, but you'll start getting a clearer idea. You'll also get a pretty clear idea of the problem with their team dynamic as a whole. And I'm going to put this in the vaguest terms that I can. There is the reason that they are not functioning well as a team goes beyond their contrasting personalities. There is a bigger problem that Danielle will pick up on very close to the end of the arc, when it's a little too late. And when I say when it's a little too late, I mean, this does end up being her journey of joining the Wardens, whether she likes to or not. And that's the path that we're putting her on. And as far as the future is concerned, and we are going to wrap up at the very least this specific, let's call it the Bleakwood arc, right? The current threat. What we want to do with the story in the future is to continue Danny's journey with them, but shift that POV once she's in to focus on a lot of the different members, because one of the big mysteries that we are going to present that will come out of this whole story can only be answered by essentially going through the perspective of each of the characters to understand how they all came together, how they're all tied together, and where it's all going to lead eventually. So our hope is that in every arc, if we get to do that, we will get to focus on still moving forward, but also looking at how each one of the characters ended up there. And from that, finding out more and more details about the team, about their connection, about the bigger problems, and the potential solutions or doomsday scenarios associated with it. So that's I'm trying to be as vague as possible, but I would put that as that's what you can expect from this arc at the very least, to set all of that up.
Awesome. So, well, you all answered like all my questions, so I appreciate your time. I did have one last question. It's in the 70s. What music do you all recommend listening to while reading it?
Elliot, you go first.
So it's funny. Not to be that guy, I listened to the soundtrack of Evil Dead 1 a lot during this. Like, I know it's not classic 70s, but that's totally what I listened to. So I thrown it on the list.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of the social media content has a lot of like 70s monster movie soundtrack, 70s and 80s monster movie. So I think that's the angle that Elliot took. For me, I always had a very like 70s rock and hard rock vibe. So even in like the Instagram stories that I do, and anybody listening, follow us on social media, because we have really, really cool content related to everything that we do. And we do incorporate music into it. So I think for me, I ended up using a lot of classic rock. So, like Black Sabbath, War Pigs came out multiple times. Immigrant Song, Led Zeppelin, which is a song that's been hunting me wherever I went since I immigrated to this country. And, like AC/DC, Highway to Hell, like that's kind of the vibe that I've been getting. It's like very like classic rock to psychedelic rock, depending on like the mood of the scene.
That's awesome. Well, you touched on the next point. So thank you all again for taking time to talk with us. For those who listen, the future people, where can they find y'all to learn about this project, other projects, all that jazz?
Well, we're on all social media. So we're on Twitter, X, Instagram, Threads, Facebook. You can find us pretty much everywhere. And our accounts are very, very active. We're constantly promoting. We have, beyond the Last Wardens, there's going to be Last Wardens adaptations. There's going to be new books that we're working on right now that are going to be announced around New York Comic Con and beyond. So it's worth following us. Also, there are our websites. It's just our name. So mine is www.amittishler.com and his is elliotSperl.com. And yeah, just follow us. It's going to be fun.
Love it. Well, thank you all again for stopping by, and I look forward to reading more about the story going forward and all the subsequent arcs to come.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.